if in fact New Mexico was more attractive to outsiders that would normally choose Utah, Nevada, Colorado, Texas, Oklahoma, any surrounding state, that would create an upward spiral for the entire state, wouldn't it?
It could. It could. Although gross receipts taxes are fairly rare at a statewide level. And accordingly, that looks a little weird too. Texas has a margins tax, which is a hybrid of an income and gross receipts tax. It allows some deductions and a little higher rate, but it's not really a corporate income tax. And it applies to everybody. Increasingly, the corporate income tax was the business activity tax, but increase over time. I said it's not 1968 anymore. People don't do business in the form of a C corporation, a subchapter C corporation, and you're an idiot if you do, unless you have really compelling reasons. If you're a public company, you may not have a choice, but because we don't tax other business forms or entities. And that creates this disparity which doesn't make any sense on almost any level. Once upon a time, the policy behind taxing C Corps differentially was access to capital markets and liability protection. But now we offer all the liability protection in the world. It's over time we've become comfortable that these pass-through entities do that. And in terms of access to capital, the hedge funds, private equity firms, there's a lot of money floating around now that didn't used to be. When what was it? Chrysler was owned by a hedge fund at one point. They were an LLC. They were paying no taxes at all. And right next door was GM and Ford. And they were sub-C corporations. Now I would suggest, what is the policy reason in taxing Chrysler differently from Ford? I can't give you a good answer. But that's a wonky argument. People love to hate on evil corporations, right? So I think if you went to a local business and said, we're going to get rid of the corporate income tax and we're going to impose a gross receipts tax on you, it would be, oh, you're giving something to the big guy. So I think it's probably not practical, even if you could make the academic arguments. But if you're choosing to have a business activity tax, you should have a tax that actually taxes all your business activity, is my only point. But with our tax, there's two paths that I think we'll go down. There's been a contract let to the Bureau of Business and Economic Research to try to determine how big that base that I was talking about earlier is, if we were to have this gross receipts tax on everything, getting rid of the exemptions and deductions. It will be very interesting to see what that answer is, because that will tell us there's a fork in the road. We can go down the road of a true gross receipts tax. Again, I think if we do, it's probably going to be less ambitious than the current proposal from the senator and representative. However, the other fork in the road is just having a more normal sales tax, like everybody else. And in fact, I would even call it a sales tax. Branding. Gross receipts tax is incorrect in describing what we have, and it also makes us look different. It's not just about branding, of course, but if we go down the path of a general retail sales tax, then what we do is we carve out services. An ideal sales tax, we would still tax consumed services. And that can be problematic too, because that means ideally, if a CPA does my personal tax return, that should be taxed. That's final consumption. But if I have her working on my Schedule C, is that a business, and how do you distinguish? So there's complicating issues there too. But an optimal sales tax would tax final consumption of goods and services, and not intermediate. Since everyone else taxes intermediate sales of tangibles, I wouldn't go after that unless we had a lot of new money on the table. I would just carve out the services in some reasonable fashion. And that would leave us with a tax structure that more closely tracks with what other states have. The problem is that results in a narrower tax base than our current GRT. About up to a third of our base is pyramiding.
A third?
A third, according to a study that we did in 2005. And so, now that number, that includes all pyramiding. So if you were just trying to do services, it's smaller and more achievable. But the question is then, what do you do? Do you raise rates, or do you expand your base in other areas, or do you have a separate gross receipts tax or something to offset those revenues and to make up that money, because the state's got a lot of bills to pay. And we have to balance our budget every year. So getting it right is critically important. You have to have circuit breakers and ways to throw the thing in reverse without dropping the transmission if things don't go well. But that's the other direction that I could see us reasonably taking. You could come up with, possibilities are endless. You can concoct all kinds of funky taxes, but I think that's potentially part of the problem. But a retail sales tax is what most states and local governments rely on pretty heavily for revenues.
And you said that what we have, our GRT, is really more like a straight sales tax.
I think it leans more towards a sales tax than a real gross receipts tax. 30 years ago, it might have leaned slightly. What we've done predictably is we've raised rates as a result of reducing the base. And so, when I moved to Santa Fe in 2003, Governor Richardson was real big on taking the tax off food. The Blue Ribbon Tax Reform Commission wouldn't support that, which was the real reason the Tax Reform Commission was created, which was somewhat ironic. But they passed it anyway. The legislature did, and certain medical services were covered by that. And what we did in return was we raised the gross receipts tax 0.5% in all municipal areas. We also promised the local governments, because we would have bankrupted them had we made them eat the cost of the deduction, that we would make up their lost portion as well. So we complicated our system a bit by forcing sellers of certain food or medical services to separately report, so that we could distribute money back to the locals as if taxes were actually paid, even though they weren't. So it cost the general fund considerably more than it would have otherwise, and we missed the estimate. So we misestimated the amount of food sales in our economy. So between it all, it cost a bunch of money, and now there's talk about repealing, the hold harmless agreement is being phased out over time. And the solution to that, to make the locals whole, was to give them more authority to raise rates. So the trend continues. The medical deductions, every year, it's like a Christmas tree. We hang more ornaments on it because someone figures out that they're not carved out of the deal like everybody else, and they raise the hand and say it's not fair, and they're not wrong, and it's not, and so the slow swirl of the degradation of your tax code down the toilet bowl continues. At the federal level, you see exactly the same thing.
Sure.
We had Tax Reform Act of 1986, and then so I think every now and then you just have to wipe the slate clean and start over. But you ought to wipe it clean in a way that makes sense, to tax appropriately. We carved out a big chunk of healthcare. Healthcare is one of our largest industries, so you can't necessarily make them tax exempt. But how do you want to tax them? You want them back in the GRT? Would that be an offset? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's a separate tax regime. Maybe it's something you do through the insurance premiums tax. But that's consumption, and if you're going to tax consumption, you got to tax consumption, and it needs to be the final consumption. What we've done in more recent years, as we raise the rates and carve out end users, the consumption base, we've basically created a targeted business inputs tax at higher and higher rates every year. So we've made the problem worse in most cases. Recently, we extended some relief to the manufacturing sector. And that really wasn't in the air. That was direct pyramiding as opposed to indirect pyramiding. But to your example earlier, when you were asking about a desk, if I build a desk, we've never taxed the wood that went into the desk. But when my business buys electricity to run the saws, when we buy cleaning solvents and rags, anything that doesn't actually end up in the final widget that comes out the door, we tax it. And a lot of states didn't necessarily do that. So in the case of, say, an Intel, we've never taxed the substrate wafer that they print a chip on. But all of the industrial gases, the cleaning solvents, the electricity, the water, all that stuff that they use, we taxed fully, which increased the cost of all of those inputs by, in Albuquerque, 7%. That makes everything considerably more expensive. But it raises money, so that's why there's the rub. That's why there's always the need to take care of my buddy's problem for $50 as opposed to everyone's problem for $5 million, and that makes the conversation much more complicated.